And this cartoon is a short on how Taiwan indigenous people are connected to the Pacific. And then I'm going to show you another short that is a rare glimpse of the first film ever on Orchid Island and their boats. That's from probably 1947. And then I'm going to show you this excellent 59-minute Navigators, Pathfinders of the Pacific. And this film is produced to show you from the point of view of a navigator in Micronesia moving out into the Pacific and having archaeological evidence to show and to prove how the cultures went from island to island. And then for this navigator to try to rekindle among his own people the skill of navigation, not only as a technical navigator, but also as a shaman, a diviner in navigation, of which he's able to use that method to sail from Hawaii to Tahiti on this boat, using the same system that he applied to Micronesia in a way that he could find within less than 40 miles, ever off course, and on the day that he expected to arrive, to cross the Pacific, only using the sail, the wind, the star, the wave, and the swell. Did anyone attend any part of the Ethnographic Film Festival? Would you like to say what you witnessed? Yeah?
Okay, I saw 2 movies, and I was one of the surprised people that saw so many Taiwanese people in the audience. I was really surprised about that, and I loved it. It was really intense, though, to see so many movies, so I decided to only watch 2 in a row. It was a bit too much to take because there was so much information, and it was really, really interesting. And I especially liked the possibility that you could ask some questions after the movie. Unfortunately, this was mainly in Chinese, so I didn't contribute much, but yeah, I liked that everyone was so interested, and there were really many people in the audience.
I went on Sunday, on Monday. I saw 2 films. I saw one that was in the Czech Republic. It was about a Hyundai plant. Kind of took over a huge plot of land, and a lot of people had to sell their farms. It was a big farming town. People sold their farms to this Hyundai plant, but a lot of people were very pressured into it. They got like threatening letters, and it was kind of their anger towards it and how it changed the town. The difference. And that was really interesting because that one was like quite funny. This film in a really funny way. The next one I saw was about people in Papua New Guinea. And it was really interesting. It was just a bit more different. That one, like the language was really interesting, and I mean similar issues in terms of trying to keep like your people's culture, but just in quite a different way and quite a different part of the world. And yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was a really nice one. I thought it was very cool. It was easy to get good seats, and there were lots of people. But I was surprised that it wasn't advertised more. Because like when I came out of the MRT, I had a really hard time finding it first. I just walked all around because there were no signs. And it was just like in the mall, on the 7th floor, in a little theater. But I was surprised that there were no like arrows or anything pointing out. Because it was such a cool event, and I would have liked to see like more posters or something for it, so more people were down.
So the theme is based on suffering and rebirth, and it shows how people, like in Papua New Guinea, they had to suffer to revitalize their culture, and sometimes ignored by the elders because their view of the culture was not what the tradition used to be. And he had to make these different groups who were initially unrelated into one cultural event as a competition, and also to have a conflict in it, which in Papua New Guinea means that then you need to slaughter a pig and offer it to make peace. And this happens all the time in New Guinea, in the highlands as well. And then to try to revitalize, to have a rebirth of their culture was their objective. So this is, and all of these themes are playing in these films. If you look carefully, you'll see that. Okay, so let's start with this one. Would you like to, Ken? Okay. And essentially, as I explained before, as Taiwan is on the continental shelf, only Taiwan has remained the coast of East Asia, the Eurasia plate, and because it is right up against the Pacific tectonic plate that is forcing up from this angle here and pushing Taiwan up to the northwest. So this coastal area has always been the coast since the first people arrived. And when they arrived, the Taiwan Strait was a grassy plain. So they just came tracking wildlife and hunting and moving around in the mountains along the coast and occupying caves along the coast. And that was about between from 30 to 40,000 years ago, and around 6,000 years ago, we have then the Taiwan Strait, a place to cross by Neolithic people, completely different in terms of their technology, especially because they have seacraft, they could voyage, they have weaving, they have architecture, they have a belief system that is very similar to what the animism of the people today in Taiwan, and refined stone tools, slate and jade, and also they had decorative earrings and necklace, bracelet, and body beautiful techniques. So they really made a very different technological, aesthetic, and agrarian difference compared to the Paleolithic people who had a stone tool like a chopper. They would take a cobble or a small boulder, break it off into a sharp piece, and just use that as a tool. And they hunted for animals as protein and used the hides for clothing, skins, because they didn't have weaving. And when these people met each other, the question is, what happened? Because the Paleolithic people completely disappeared. And then we have a Neolithic population that thrives in Taiwan from 6,000 years to the present. And it's believed that one of these groups in Taiwan then broke off a linguistic group, probably to settle in Luzon, the Philippines. And these languages had several thousand years in each stage for their incubation to become a modern language. Now the question is, when did the Austronesian languages become the languages as we know them today? Did they incubate in Taiwan or in the Solomon Islands, in Sumatra? And these are other places where the language developed. So the only point of the so-called homeland is that the most complex structure of the languages and the oldest evidence of the Neolithic cultures that spread across the Pacific can be found in Taiwan. So essentially these are not people migrating out of Taiwan, these are trade languages. So they would be trading out, for example, nephrite jade from Hualien to the Batanes Islands, as I mentioned, and then they would go to Borneo, to Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and as they traded out, they would have used their language as modern Malay is today, a trade language that extends from Malaysia across Indonesia. And so there's the base population of the Austronesian speakers are in Indonesia. So that's over 100 million people there. And they use this language because in Indonesia, each island has its own language. But modern Bahasa Malay or Indonesia and they're both similar languages, have been trade languages that have covered over the archipelago all the way out to the Solomon Islands, known as the Malayo-Polynesian branch of the Austronesian language family. And this evidence in the past 20 years or 30 years has caused people to understand the importance of Taiwan in terms of linguistic and cultural Pacific island development. Now what is also mentioned in the film is that probably if you came to an uninhabited island with your party from, let's say you're the son of a chief or something and you want to then make your own chiefdom, then, or you're a breakaway, you're a renegade from your people, you get into an argument, you refuse to slaughter the pig and get to another island, and then those people who go with you then can inhabit that island, and then you become the chief there, and then you're venerated as an ancestor. So it's believed also they had this idea to make platforms for chiefs without competition if you're the first one on the island with your people. And that's why they kept searching for other islands and went so far to do so. But when we look at this film on the Navigator, we're going to find out how they did that. Okay, so let's play it once again while it's fresh.
What do you think about, as far as ethnicity goes? Because I know, for instance, people like in Hawaii and like the Maoris in New Zealand, maybe even Indonesian or Filipinos almost look similar. So could they trace language with like different ethnic groups? Or are they all part of, you know, like the Aboriginal people here don't look the same, for instance? You know what I mean? So are there a lot of different studies and stuff with ethnicity?
Yeah, so one of the problems with this introduction is that they don't look at the ethnicity or the types of people as associated with a language system. And so, of course, the Amis in Taiwan, they're perhaps the taller people, and the Taiwan are shorter people, stockier, and Bunun look different from Ataya speakers. And then if you go to also in the Philippines, all these different groups, they look different. And so the language is carried linguistically. For example, the best example is the other large language family, the Indo-European, that extends from Ireland to Sri Lanka and across all of Eurasia, where all these different peoples in India or Central Asia, in Europe, Scandinavia, all look different, yet they're all speaking one language family. So language can be then transferred to these different islands where people pick it up. So as it's skirting Melanesia, now the Papuan speakers and they look completely different because they have much darker skin. Melanesia actually means the island archipelago of the black Melanesia. And they have very curly hair, where most Austronesian speakers have wavy or straighter hair, but not as straight as people in China, for example. And for these different appearances of the people, yet they carry these languages from island to island. And as they went to these different islands and lived there, they then developed their own style of speaking the Austronesian or the Malayo-Polynesian language on their island, and especially when they skirted Melanesia. So some people believe that the skirting of Melanesia and picking up some of the Melanesian traits in the Solomon Islands might have actually been the last incubation of the modern languages that went all the way to Easter Island. Then there's another component. As we know, the sweet potato has come from South America, from Peru. So Austronesian speakers then got to South America, and then they started to bring the sweet potato back all the way across the Pacific. And so then we know that actually they went there and they came back, and then they would have also traded back through, again, through Polynesia, Melanesia, Indonesia, and back up through the Philippines, planting their sweet potato. And just from that evidence of the sweet potato, we have this reverse trade system coming back. So it's not just moving out, it's also coming back in to Southeast Asia. And it should also be mentioned that with the exception of central Vietnam, where the people actually settled from Sumatra and part of the Malay Peninsula, we have practically all of these islands as an island language family, and not having a continental association with Africa or the Americas or Australia or mainland Southeast Asia. And in mainland Southeast Asia, it's called the Austroasiatic language family, and it's a cousin to the Austronesian language family, but it's different and quite separate. There we have the Khmer languages, and up through the ancient early civilization people that are predating 2,000 years ago. Their languages were already set through mainland Southeast Asia. So all these different peoples, no matter their appearance, are picking up, even the Papuans have picked up Austronesian languages, and they look completely different. So, and they're not in the islands, but just along the islands and coasts of New Guinea. Now, the reason that, especially in Taiwan, on one island, people look so different is because of their practice of headhunting and keeping their space separate from other peoples, so that they kept their language and their village, their customs intact. And therefore they're, as I mentioned before, if the man retires from headhunting, then he starts to raise his family, and people are not going to marry out to other villages. They marry within their own community. And then you have people looking similar to each other in the community and speaking that language over many generations. Okay, now we're going to go to the next is on Orchid Island. It's a silent, black and white documentary, I believe from 1947, and you can see how the first film of their... Now, when you see these people, you have to realize that already they had been occupied by Japan for 50 years. Okay. it was a research expedition. So they were taking samples. So this was not an activity of the people. They would dive for fish, spearfishing, but not to bring up coral. And I mean, they used coral sometimes in their building, but not extensively. They used mostly rock. But this was an expedition to show their commitment to their new government and to be explored by the new government.
What did most of the people on these islands eat? Because did they have, like, what level of farming did they have? Because I mean, if you're fishing, I would think you've got to catch a lot of fish for, you know, a few thousand people.
Right.
You know, so what were their techniques? Or was it like hunting and gathering societies? I mean, I think a lot of these islands, I don't even know if they have deer or any kind of animals, so.
That's what we're going to see next. This is well explained here. But for Orchid Island, it shows that they were trying to grow corn and things. Actually, they don't. They have taro and yam. They have wild boar, and most of their protein is from fishing.
All
And-
spear fishing?
Yes, and there's not enough fish just around Orchid Island, so they go to another island. They call it their supermarket island. Yes, and we're going to find out how they do that. It's a custom throughout the islands that you reserve one island for your resources and one island to live on. Yes.
What was the purpose of telling the kids to line up and march?
They went into a shelter because of the war.
And why did they have to march and line up like that?
So I believe they were trained by the Japanese initially to do that. And they would march into the shelter to be safe. And then the KMT wanted to make sure because in 1947, still it was unknown about the future. And of course, as you know, the government moved in 1949 to Taiwan. And then there was this anti-communist campaign. And Orchid Island could be a place where the communists might come from if they came around from the east somehow. So the people were being trained to, it was in the time of the Civil War and from just the Second World War. So they were still having military drills.
But the shelter was on the ground. It was not like underground.
Yes, it's a tunnel that goes, they built the, where I live in Hualien, there are many. And I don't know if they were built by the Japanese or later on, but they're the whole infrastructure of tunnels of defense along the East Coast are still in these concrete tunnels and defenses, bunkers. Okay, now we're going to see really a wonderful film, and this is called The Navigators, and it is it has two components. One is that the main character, who is a navigator of the highest rank, and he's still navigating and building boats in Micronesia. And then there is the evidence of archaeology that you're going to learn about from Roger Green and Pat Kirch about the archaeology, Lapita culture, and pottery. And then we're going to learn about how using a system in Micronesia could apply to any of the islands in the Pacific. So we can play this one.
Like, I'm not sure how realistic Silicon Valley was, but from seeing how the Japanese entered in that movie to Taiwan, it looked very brutal. But from what I saw from this video, the KMT seemed to enter very peacefully and treat the Aboriginals very nicely. So is it safe to say that they gathered information before they entered Taiwan as to like treat the locals very peacefully?
Well, I would say basically when Japan surrendered, it was an unconditional surrender. And I think all of the people peacefully surrendered to the KMT and to the Americans. So there wasn't any local battle against the KMT when they arrived, or the Americans. And they didn't want to fight any more further. And so actually for Japan losing the war pacified the people to surrender. Everyone surrendered. Yeah.
But how much did the people on those small islands actually know and understand about the war? What was going on?
Yeah, actually, that was kind of
Yeah. So if they also thought they surrendered, they must have some understanding.
In Orchid Island, as I mentioned, there was a guy who was recounting to me in his language, Yami, about how they were once masters of their own island, and then they were occupied by Japan, and then they got bombed by the Americans, and that's, quite a reality to them, and especially between 1941 to 45, it was, Japan was on high alert and had gun installations there to fight against American bombers, and so they were part of that. They knew all of that happening to their island, and then suddenly in 1945 August it all ceased. The war just ended. And then 2 years later, the KMT shows up and says, okay, now raise the flag, and here we are. And they decided just to do that, and there wasn't any conflict. Actually, the people in Orchid Island, they don't have conflict between themselves with other groups, and they only come dressed to fight spirits. And I find that interesting when they're coming to greet the KMT officials. They're all dressed in this armor that they would use to protect themselves from evil spirits. And of course they thought this was like a regalia, like a welcome suit, but it wasn't. It was for the people of Orchid Island, it was a way to protect themselves.
Did the KMT go to Orchid Island a lot after
They tried to keep it up through the 70s without electricity. The electricity came in 81. And then they started to use it from the late 80s as a nuclear waste disposal area. And then promised the people a subsidy and built the road and schools. So it wasn't until the 80s that actually they were giving the people infrastructure. So until then, they pretty much left them alone and only treated, as the Japanese did, Orchid Island as a place that might need military defense. So for a long time, the people, they were unable to fish at their supermarket because it was considered to be an outlier island that could require military attention and sort of a military outpost. Well, there's not enough water there to sustain people to live there. And actually the island was used for shelling and military practice. So that wasn't very good for the people. So, Yeah.
Can we consider what we just watched a KMT propaganda? Like, could we consider it? Because the way that they're so peacefully doing it and they're using the tools they're given, could it be considered propaganda?
Well, I'm sure that this film was shown as a newsreel in theaters in Taiwan to show that the KMT arrives and the flag's up and they're there to welcome the scientific experiments and collections of this government party. Sure.
By the way, you mentioned the Americans bombed the island.
Yeah.
Did the Americans bomb other areas in Taiwan too?
Yes, sure.
Oh, really? Quite a lot, or what areas?
Taipei.
Oh, really?
And yes, throughout Taiwan, all of the Japanese installations were bombed. I mean, finally Japan had very little defense. And but Taiwan was not a primary target. It was Okinawa. So Taiwan actually was bypassed to capture Okinawa, and Japanese put up a great resistance there.
Where were they flying from? Philippines or from Kunming or from Yunnan?
From Micronesia, from Guam, Saipan. And finally, essentially, in terms of the Battle of Okinawa, Japan didn't have any air support anymore. And it was completely surrounded by the U.S. fleet, and Marines moved on shore, but they put up a great resistance. They were dug in and prepared to fight to the last man, and they did, practically. So this is really and that was Okinawa completely devastated. And Taiwan was spared that devastation. So there wasn't a land battle in Taiwan. It was just simply bombing.
Did a lot of civilians get killed?
No. Very few casualties. Mostly military installations. Now, when people from Taiwan and the Japanese army, when they surrendered, the first thing they would do when they would surrender to the Americans was say, "I'm Taiwanese, I'm Taiwanese," in the Philippines. And they were treated completely differently. The Americans took them to a resort in Georgia, gave them the best treatment. Yeah. Completely different from hardened Japanese soldiers who were prepared to die rather than surrender. Especially in the open sea, because the first category of a navigator is the technical skill, and that is what he's trying to teach. But only through the initiation of a shamanic ceremony, then he has further skills of knowing magic, but you might call it a kind of intuition, so that he can identify the swells and the wind, not simply objectively looking for the stars, but he will have other spiritual or intuitive skills that are related to nature that he can rely on. Yes.
Are women excluded from these expeditions, or are there exceptions, or is the division of labor just?
That's a very good question. Discussion?
I believe it's mainly male dominated, and they're not. It's kind of tradition where the females do their thing and the males do this, and this is their priority. This is their job, and they oversee it. I mean, did you ever see any other like Aboriginal movies like The Whale Rider? Did you see that? About it was about New Zealand, and pretty much this girl was the leader's the grandfather was, and it was his grandchild, and she wanted to become the new leader, but because she was a girl, he refused to acknowledge her because he like, no, this is men's role, but they're losing their culture. It's actually a really good movie. I cried. Yeah, but I think they keep it very distinctive, very separate.
But I imagine during these migrations, the women would have to be in the bus, right? I mean,
Why?
when they have these massive migrations, which I mean, this is a different.
What do you mean by a mass migration?
So when they move from Melanesia down to
Yeah, when they have the
Polynesia,
chiefdom.
they have
I would think they would
During the
just
chief.
go with the lady on the land. I don't know.
You mean like to populate a new island?
to populate
Yeah.
the island. That's what I mean.
I would think
It's not
that
just the
comes
land that are just
second.
going.
I think it would probably be men first to make sure that there is something to go to, and then signal back, oh, bring us forward a wife, and whoever's like, or, ta-da, new population.
So in Orchid Island, it's a taboo for women even to touch a boat. And so that's a very good question, because if there is migration to populate the islands, 10,000 islands, you must bring women. And if you navigate successfully to an island, establish it, and you will always bring with you the pig, the chicken, and your taro to plant. And then you need to bring the women. So I think in the very large double-hulled boats that they navigated with, they would bring, to establish a colony, the women with them and heirlooms.
Would that go over first, or would that go over second?
Secondary. Yeah, it would be a colonization voyage. And I think then, in that case, women would be allowed. But there must have been some divination with the boat to allow women. Because they were not, for example, in the boat that went from Hawaii to Tahiti, with that reenactment of the sail that went very beautifully, only men aboard the boat. So when they went for exploration, it was men building the boat and sailing the boat. So when they went to their islands to catch fish at the reefs, only men did that. But if they were catching fish on their own island, ritually then was men and women doing it. But that's why it only happened just a few times a year. It was a special event, communal event.
I think usually they wouldn't have women because it's such physically demanding kind of thing. And it's also like when you're in a storm or there's an issue, it's very important that everyone does a certain thing or everyone can die. I commercial fished the last 2 summers in Alaska. And I'll tell you, like bad storms and stuff like that, like it's tear. Like, I mean, if people aren't doing the right thing and
Right.
with fishing and things, you'll die. I mean, it's just, I mean, that's why they have the highest mortality rate, even in the U.S. of fishermen dying, you know, so you can have people panicking or getting seasick is another issue. Yeah, there's a lot of things, but definitely physical.
So they would have built the most stable craft, double-hulled, and to transport women and heirlooms and other aspects of what they wanted to bring for their settlement. But I believe first they would establish where they were going.
I know it was about navigators, but he was 50 years old with 16 children. I thought that was kind of interesting because if he's learning navigation, he went away for school and everything. Where did the 16 children come from? I don't know. I don't know. I felt like it was very interesting because he's very determined to keep them on the island, to keep the tribe. do you think he was an exception? So he like created a lot more children in hopes of keeping them on the island?
Probably.
Like he's special?
He wanted to have at least some of his children to remain with him and to learn what he learned, to be his apprentice.
Do you know anything about like, well, it happened next to DC, was there ever a follow-up or article or anything? Like, did his son actually learn everything?
National Geographic has an article.
Okay.
Time magazine.
Like, as in afterwards, like
Yes.
10 years later?
That's right.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know what they said? Like, did it work?
Yes. Yeah, they're still navigators there. He trained, but he was worried because he was just one of the few of, as he mentioned, all of the Pacific Islands had navigators, multiple navigators, and now only in Micronesia the last ones remain. What about the people who went to Easter Island? They got there, and then they started to cut down their forests, their trees, to make rollers to move large monumental heads for chiefs until they didn't have a tree left and not the wood to build a ship to sail back. Then they just stayed there until the Europeans showed up. So this is to acknowledge the ecology. So they do that very well in Orchid Island. They have all their breadfruit trees planted. They know how long it takes, how many 15 years to grow, to mature. Then it's cut to build a boat, and each man on Orchid Island can build a boat. And so and they don't use the coconut for caulking. They only use the breadfruit pitch, and they just lay the pieces together. They don't have any special wrap to hold the planks together. They just fit perfectly, and they're all made with one axe, shaved and shaved until it matches so perfectly. And every time they put it on, if it's just even a millimeter off, they'll pull it off and they'll scrape that millimeter, put it back on until it matches seamlessly. Then they put in the breadfruit pitch, lay it on, and just keep it there, and it seals.
How long does that take?
And they don't have lashing, except at the bow and the stern.
But like, how long does
It
it
takes-
take?
It takes them probably a few months to make a boat, but if you get the whole village, it could be done. It takes more than the time to make the boat, because you have to plant and harvest the tree, cut the tree, cut it into planks,
Well, I was just thinking in the movie they said it took about 2 weeks.
and the division of labor. Yeah, but in Orchid Island, because they use such precision,
Yeah.
and also their island is not flat, so where they have to climb up a mountain. It takes a few weeks just to haul down the wood. You know, but it might take maybe up to 3 weeks for one man or two to make a small boat.
And how long can this boat be used?
They're used at least 10 or 12 years.
So you would say that the Orchid Island tribe kept their culture a lot better than the rest of the Polynesian islands kept.
So what happened is, as it's mentioned, that when they got to Hawaii, they got comfortable. And they had so many resources. So then they started neglecting to sail back.
Orchid Islands, yeah.
And also it happened in Orchid Island, they got comfortable there.
Yeah.
And then they neglected to sail back to the other islands, so they stayed on Orchid Island. So then they started making craft just for their fishing and going to Little Orchid Island and creating their own community there. But in the beginning, including the Hawaiian Islands, they would be sailing the whole distance back and forth frequently until they were very well established in Hawaii, and they just stayed there basically. But there is a story that when Captain Cook arrived in Hawaii, the Hawaiians sailed down to Tahiti and told the people there that they should learn a few words in English to greet Captain Cook because he would soon be arriving. And Captain Cook was surprised that they could get there with his ships that seemed to go rapidly across the Pacific. They got there before him and told the people how to greet him, and he was so surprised when they could greet him in English when he arrived. So they were still sailing at that time, the great distance. But once the Europeans had their ships on the high seas, then people would hitch a ride or even sign up as the crew of those ships. And then gradually their native skills were lost. Now why it still continues in Micronesia is simply because you have the necessity to sail 10 hours to harvest enough fish to provide their own island. They need the outlier islands to provide resources, like their hunting grounds. And it's also mentioned, as in Taiwan with hunting grounds and the preservation of your own space and resources, that you need permission. So other people would sail first to their island, ask permission, and then go to the islands with reefs for harvesting fish.
I know this was made in 1983, but they kind of neglected all of the mention of Taiwan in it. Is that because?
Yes,
it
it's
hasn't
before
been
the Taiwan, but they did start it. Actually, they showed in the map from Taiwan, the Philippines, and the route. But it was actually coincidentally in 1983 that when I met up with, or 84, Peter Bellwood. And he was just thinking about connecting. I met him at a conference, and in the Philippines, they were calling their archaeology the Austronesian-speaking stones from Taiwan. And then they were starting to do the archaeology back into Taiwan. And so when you look at the lapita, the sherds, the pottery dates back with those motifs in Taiwan. That goes back about 6,000 years. And then you find it in the Philippines around 4,500 years. And then further out in the Pacific about 3,000 years. And then as Roger Green was looking at those pieces dating back about 1,300 years, 1,200 years. Like that, it gets younger as it moves out. And then you can also look at the motifs. So if they're using motifs similar to Taiwan, the Philippines, and Micronesia, and as they move out, and then you have weaving until you get to the Santa Cruz Islands, and then you start having tapa cloth, the pounded cloth paper that's made, and then grass skirts rather than woven cloth. And then that, after you pass Santa Cruz Islands, then it really becomes the marker, the gateway to Polynesia and the distinct Polynesian cultures. So there is some, and also the pottery changes. So you have the loss of some things and gaining other things. You gain more skills in navigation for long distance voyaging, but you're losing weaving. And also you're losing, as in Taiwan, people had rice and millet, and that gets lost as it transfers across to the islands. Then you have just the taro.
Would it be lost? What if it was a woman's thing and it would be coming over later?
But they were not planting
like,
rice there.
like, yeah,
The islands could not sustain rice. They were like coral reef islands, and they didn't have irrigation.
They just eat fish when they're out there the whole time and bring some food. What about water? Because there's no fresh water. Do they bring that with them?
When I've sailed in the open ocean, I was surprised that, because I would think they would have to bring a lot of kegs of water and all that, but actually they wait for a squall or rainstorm, and they put out their canvas and collect the water. And all the time while we're sailing, throwing out fish lines and catching fish and bringing in the fish. I was so surprised they could do that so easily. But because we're just in the open sea and you have a lure with the fish on it, fish will latch on to the hook, bring it in. It's just on a cord, no rods or anything. Throw it onto the deck of the boat, and then they just chop it up and have sashimi. And we had water and raw fish as we sailed, and they didn't have to stock supplies. And if they did stock supplies, they would have livestock that they would want to transport to the new islands or to other places that they were going to.
Does it rain such a regular?
Yes,
Does?
quite
Okay.
often. Yeah.
So you pick up one of these trips?
And I'm very astonished when I'm at my house in Huali and I look over the ocean, and actually I can see the different squalls over the ocean. You can see that 40 miles out there's a definite rainstorm on that spot, and then it's clear and sunshine, and you can see another squall and a rainstorm over there, and they're like cells of rain that come right down in torrential rain on that spot. It's happening all the time. So you sail through these squalls of fresh water and collect in canvas and go on. You have a question? Some of my students, they have come from Norway, and they were based in Hawaii, and they would hire on because in Norway they had also the skills of sailing for these expeditions through Tahiti and the South Pacific Islands, and then would eventually visit Taiwan and then check in and study anthropology or something while they were here. But one of the complaints that I hear from some friends who are Taiwanese that have a long ancestry with Taiwan is that this maritime island culture of Taiwan, and in fact if you go to like Penghu, you can meet people who have been to Argentina, Ecuador, South Africa, and all these places because they have gone on fishing boats all over the world. And then you look at, and also at Dan Shui, Bali, there was once the largest private yacht construction in the world going on. at one time through the 80s. And Taiwan has gradually lost its maritime culture. And people are doing that less, fishing less, and taking their own boats out less, and this whole culture being the maritime seafarer, sailor, fisherman is being lost in Taiwan. And again, due to having more comforts, suburban life, build your apartment and your house and live near the city and have the conveniences. I still have one of my adopted brothers in Sri Lanka who spends about half the year at sea on ships. But that's his lifestyle. He's the only one in the family who does that. So for island people to lose their navigation skills is also one of the problems of maintaining your islandness. So what's going to happen to the people on an island where they cannot get enough food resources because they don't have navigators? Then they have to abandon their island and move to larger islands where there are cities. And then those islands get abandoned and the cities become more populous. So it's very difficult to maintain a village way of life lifestyle. They don't have electricity there. They don't have conveniences. They have a square mile of coral reef island that's just a few meters above sea level. And it's a beautiful life. But then once you go to another island, you visit Guam or Saipan and you see the city and the nightlife, and you have electricity and running water and conveniences and a paycheck, or maybe, then you might think to abandon your island and move to the city. And that's happening all over the world. Yes.
Along that topic, what do you think it would take for Mao to convince his youngest children to stay within the more traditional world, since there's the appeal of education?
Well, what he said is correct. If he doesn't allow his youngest to leave, and if they don't know any other place, and they're only educated on their island, and they just learn navigation, then they will do that. They will learn that. They'll be proud and happy to learn navigation from a master. And but once you go off to another place, to the bright lights in the city, then you decide maybe you don't want to be a navigator. You don't want to sit on a seafaring craft for 10 hours going to fish on an island with a reef and come back with the fish and just make boats and babies. Yes.
What was the sleeping arrangements like for like the chief or the leader of the boat? They take turns with someone sleeping, or?
So there's always the navigator and his apprentice. They always go together. And the navigation skills are shared. And also in this film it shows very nicely how the navigator is training the people on board as he's sailing, so that everyone has a sense of what's going on.
have a question. Well, if they weren't, does the island of Taiwan have any modern conveniences that you know of? Do you know? Like, do they have TV or?
No,
electricity?
they don't have.
And how do you know about making movies?
No,
He's like, I want to make this
he
movie.
he said that he had been to the other islands, the city, and went to schools with the electricity and those facilities, and probably part of the education is, at least from my elementary school education, we would see films, movies, documentaries, and that's part of the educational process.
But they didn't have electricity. How did they watch TV?
In the other islands where he studied,
Well, I mean, like, he was hoping that other kids would see it, like, the younger generation would build an interest in it
Yes.
by watching the movie.
That's
he
right.
means the other islands, only if he means his own island,
That's
would stay
right.
primitive.
That's
but everyone
right.
else could become back.
you see, that's the trick. So he makes the movie, and then when they go from those islands without electricity, village islands, to a place like Saipan and Guam and the larger islands, and then they're going to, in the classroom, see that movie. Aha! Then they're going to think, oh, that's Daddy. I need to get back, you know. And but not only for his own children, it's made so that all of the people of these islands can see and learn from his instruction on navigation. But this is only an introduction, and if he then inspires people to really learn that, it takes years to do so. And this film has inspired people actually to come back to his island and learn navigation.
But only men.
Yes.
Like, you don't think he'll lower his bar and let women in if they need it to?
No. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You said that the KMT gave Orchid Island electricity in 1981. Was that because there was a demand for it, or you just got around to it?
Okay, so there was.
You want the conspiracy theory?
Conspiracy theory.
I believe that they were planning a place to put their nuclear waste, of which they needed to build a facility for that required electricity. And
But is there?
and the whole scenario with nuclear waste is part of Thai Power. So Thai Power decided to initiate, not the government, generally not for education or infrastructure. It was Thai Power that decided that it needed to have electricity there. And the people for the nuclear waste site, all the people in Orchid Island received compensation. So when they are protesting against the government, or Thai Power, I should say, to remove the nuclear waste, then Thai Power will say, well, then we're going to withdraw your checks.
So they really.
And maybe we have given,
compensation?
they'll say, maybe we have given you some advance money, then you need to pay that back. Uh-oh. Then that quells the protest, because then people, they say, well, we can't pay you back, we cannot. So essentially the situation is based on a lease, a rental. And not only for that land, there was land also used for a prison, a penitentiary there, and other facilities, a military, that then the government had to take land from the local people and give them compensation and money for lease. So with all these so-called development projects, they have received compensation and the building of schools. So the protest is politically motivated, but when it comes down to their economics, they have to back off.
why they pick Orchid Island over like Palm Like, Palm does that have outside of there?
What you do is that you put the waste where there is less political resistance.
Palm like more political resistance.
And Chen Shui-bian, he went there and he said that he would promise to take it off. Nothing has been done. And then where do you put it? Now the whole idea, since the tsunami and earthquake in Japan and the breakdown of their nuclear power plant is in Germany and other places, now in Taiwan, is to start to close down the plants, power plants. And there are 2 old power plants in the north of Taiwan that need to be shut down soon. But then again, where do you put the waste? The radiation that's has to be buried or put in. Now in Sweden, they're putting it into underground in the rock, under a town, a village, that's very deep, layered into a granite cavern that they're artificially building to lay it in. That would be secure. But what has happened in Orchid Island is that the Greenpeace people, they get out there and they do their subversion inspection. They somehow get in, find out what's going on, and their report is that these canisters with this radiation is now in such a state that they're unable to be removed. They're already leaking inside the facility. So you would have to take out each one individually and encase it in concrete, each steel drum, and take it out in a concrete canister and remove it, and that would be huge expense. And to operate such a removal, and then where do you put it? It has to be removed. It has to go somewhere at some time. And they're trying to get an Amis village to take it with compensation in Taidong. So, and they're not so happy about that, And so this is it's a difficult when you go into that nuclear energy. You have to think about the whole thing, whole package, the whole system. And what is very dangerous in Taiwan is that the canisters in the power plants, because they cannot transport them anymore to Orchid Island, they finally sent back the boat. The boats are still coming, and finally the people all stood at the harbor, and it didn't allow the boat to land. And the boat had to go back to the power plant in northern Taiwan. So now the power plants are being stockpiled to the ceiling. And that's just a few miles from here. What happens if there's an earthquake or whatever that might fracture and cause the damage there? So it's a big problem. It's an issue that's unresolved in Taiwan, especially for the people of Orchid Island. So if they do take off the nuclear waste and Taipower decides to close shop, then they're back to not having electricity. They're not going to pay for it. Yeah. Okay, any other question, comment?
I don't know how this nuclear power plants have they affected so they moved from
People claim they're getting cancer, There's some evidence about that. It's low-level radiation, but where it's located is on some land that where some villages are nearby, and the older people who are there are suffering from that, simply from long-term exposure to that. And also it's felt that if Greenpeace is correct, and actually it's being seeping down into the water table, it will go into the water table of the next village. It's a very serious problem. So someone had a brilliant idea to send it to North Korea. Yeah. And it was all in the newspaper. North Korea accepts nuclear waste from Orchid Island. And there was a stop to that immediately because it would have to be transported through international waters and through the waters of Japan, if not China or Russia, to get to North Korea. And the regulation for sending nuclear waste through international and territorial waters, especially of Japan, was unacceptable. So then how would you get it there? By flight? Over what airspace, right? So it's really it's so difficult to move out from some border to another country.
That is the only alternative.
Russia, it was discovered, was putting nuclear waste in barrels and dumping it off into the Sea of Japan from fishing boats. So that was discovered and stopped that.
But like they don't have enough space in Russia, they have to throw it in the water, you know.
Yeah, because of the political issue on land, where to put it. And in the U.S. it's put in Nevada, and that's on military land. It's a military test missile site, and in deep caverns, and there's no people there, far away from Las Vegas, and also that's where they tested nuclear weapons in that area. So it's already restricted by radiation because of those tests, and so this then is put underground in that region, in the mountains, under the desert, and hopefully it's going to stay there. But scientists believe that eventually it's going to leak into some layers of the earth, and unless it's as what they're doing in Sweden, they put it all in very carefully made canisters that can be rolled into granite subterranean chambers, and that can be constantly inspected, viewed, inspected, moved, checked, how it's doing. It's not just forgotten there.
I mean, the discussion is everywhere the same. It's
Yeah.
either you have it legally in your own country, like Sweden, or you do the illegal way, like Russia, or you deport it into a poor country.
Yeah.
That's probably all you can do.
But also getting it there is the problem.
Yeah.
And so,
But I don't think that like shipping it to North Korea is a good solution. So
no. So, and because of the size and scale of Orchid Island, it should not have ever gone there. But then the government says, well, we gave them electricity, we gave them infrastructure, we gave them schools, we gave them so much because they received it. But they didn't want to receive it, but they took the money.
So I have to.
Do they still all get money like once a year or something? Or
Yeah, they get,
Is it a
it's,
significant amount?
it has to be apportioned by, not as a bribe, but like subsidy for school children and infrastructure, the building of educational facilities. It has to be supporting NGOs, some kind of public service allocation and for the community. But individuals also receive subsidy checks for that, because lease checks, just for leasing it, the land. So essentially, today we have learned how people, not people from Taiwan, but their language origins out of Taiwan, and how people then mixed voyaging, and not all the people, but just those people who voyaged to the other islands, to the Philippines and around Micronesia and to the outer islands of Melanesia into Polynesia, and how this whole system spread across 10,000 islands with a single language family, finding roots in Taiwan, but on the other hand, it incubated on the way to develop. So it became all these separate languages. And incubation happened in Sumatra, it happened for the Malay languages, it happened in Solomon Islands for the Polynesian languages. So it would stop for some time in some place and then cross into further islands with the use of navigation for spreading the language, and of course with people going there. So the theory is that Taiwan is one of the generators in the Pacific for language and culture. And we could say that's the first layer of from the Neolithic offering for the people of Taiwan and the Pacific. Next week I'm hoping to, if you're willing, to take you to Academia Sinica. It's an institute for learning in Nangan, and to the Institute of Ethnology to visit their museum for an open house. It's not open in the evening, but I've talked to the director of the museum to have it open from, let's say, 7 to 9. So we could still meet here at 6:30 next week and then go there. But I will also update you by email and give you the map, because you might be living on that side of the city and you could go there directly. And in that museum, you will see the different cultures of the indigenous people of Taiwan and how they integrated into the Minnan, the Fujian and Fuzhou and the Guangdong populations.